So, good evening, everyone. I am Marcia Moore, and on behalf of the Gateway Science Museum, I am once again very delighted to welcome you to this, the fourth and final talk in our Museum Without Walls lecture series on fossils, formations, and extinctions. We again have a real treat in store for you. But first, I want to express our gratitude to our partner, North State Public Radio, a co-sponsor of this series. And we are especially appreciative of all our speakers who are donating their time, talents, and knowledge to the furtherance of teaching and learning about science in our region and beyond. And we do acknowledge and are mindful that CSU Chico stands on lands that were originally occupied by the first people of this area, the Mechoopda. We recognize their distinctive spiritual relationship with this land and the waters that run through campus. We are humbled that our campus resides upon sacred lands that once sustained the Mechoopda people for centuries. A brief housekeeping detail: these sessions are being recorded, so if you do not want to be recorded personally, you may turn off your video. Tonight, I am so pleased to introduce to you Dr. Neil Kelley, Assistant Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at Vanderbilt University, where he teaches courses in paleontology and evolutionary biology. His undergraduate degree is from Oberlin College, and he completed his PhD at the University of California, Davis. He worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Smithsonian Institution and has had more than 25 scientific articles published. He has been featured in the Smithsonian Magazine Online and on National Public Radio, and has done field work in various parts of the world, including China and the Western United States, including our own Shasta County. Dr. Kelley will be speaking to us on Triassic marine reptiles in the American West. He will talk for approximately 45 minutes, graciously coming to us from Nashville, where it is now after 9 p.m. Thank you, Dr. Kelley. And we'll take questions at the end of his talk. Please put your questions in the chat column, where they will be passed on to Dr. Kelley by Adrian McGraw, our museum's executive director. Dr. Kelley, we are so honored to have you with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Marcia. Thanks for everyone for showing up. I will queue up my PowerPoint here. Great. Okay, so tonight I want to talk a bit about sort of the reason that we want to understand the evolution of marine reptiles in the Triassic, and the reason why Western United States and especially Northern California is essential for understanding this story. So my lengthy and somewhat pretentious title is From Mountains to Museums and Back Again, because I want to reinforce this idea that we're always going out to look for new information, coming back to museums, which are essential repositories for curating that information, and then going back out to get a little bit more and coming back. This will be a persistent theme in the talk. But also have to shout out my childhood friend whose father had a taxidermy shop. Oh, make sure I'm here, called Dead Things and Stuff. And I think that's a workable alternate title for this presentation, because we're talking about things that are dead and the stuff that's important about them. I'll expand on the land acknowledgement. Thank you so much for Marcia setting that tone, because this is a wide-ranging talk geographically and culturally. We're indebted to a number of different peoples across, really ranging from contemporary Alaska down to Mexico. So all of these people are worth acknowledging due to their connection to the land and the resources and the fossils that we will be talking about today. And my own institution is located on traditional lands of Cherokee, Shawnee, and Yuki people. Okay, so kind of how I want to set this up is introducing the idea of why the Triassic in particular is a really important time for understanding the trajectory of the history of life on Earth, why marine reptiles are worth understanding, and then why the records from the Western United States and North America in general, and especially Northern California, are really essential for understanding what happened with a key transition in marine ecosystems that began around 250 million years ago. And yes, because it matters. So here's a graph. This is actually from Encyclopedia Britannica, but it's a useful one that helps to understand the trajectory of life on Earth going back to 600 plus million years ago. And the idea here from left to right is that based on the fossil record, we perceive that biological diversity has been increasing over time. This has been a central sort of topic of debate and consideration in paleontology for a long time. There's reasons to believe that this signal is basically true, that diversity has increased based on interactions between organisms and their environment. There's also reasons to think that the fossil record is not a perfect transcription of the history of life, and that there may be some limitations or biases in our fossil record in terms of trying to reconstruct this history. But based on large-scale studies of what we see in the fossil record, we are reasonably confident that this increase in diversity is not continuous over time. It's not a straight line. It's had fits and starts. It's gone up and down over time, that there's been times where diversity of organisms has increased dramatically. There's been times where it has dropped dramatically. And those major drops here, which are these sort of little down marks on this particular figure, are mass extinction events. And the sort of general understanding of the history of life at this point recognizes at least 5 mass extinction events within the last 500 plus million years of life, where all of a sudden a large proportion of organisms that were around suddenly disappear out of the fossil record and become replaced by different things. There's reasons to think that we might be living in another mass extinction event. This one would be unique in Earth history because it's likely largely caused by human interactions with the environment, habitat loss, overhunting, overfishing, climate change, etc. But if we want to understand and contextualize our current biodiversity crisis, one way to better understand it is to look at the fossil record and understand what was happening. So it's a lot of table setting, but the Triassic here is one interval in the history of life that extends roughly 250 to 200 million years ago. And it's noteworthy for being bracketed by two actually of these mass extinction events. So there's a mass extinction event leading into the Triassic and one at the end of the Triassic. The one leading into the Triassic, the end Permian mass extinction event, is we believe from the fossil record, the single largest mass extinction event recorded in all of Earth history. Depending on how you tally things, up to 95% of species in the oceans went extinct abruptly during this event. It's just one artist reconstruction down here on the lower left, kind of highlighting that this was not confined to a particular region or a particular environment. It occurred simultaneously, although it transpired over several million years across the entire planet and in terrestrial and marine environments. And so when we look at either land organisms, plants and animals, or marine organisms, plants and animals in the Permian, and those that come later, they're very different. There's a striking difference between the types of things that we find. Our best understanding for the driver of this is a very massive volcanic event that occurred in what is now Siberia, where like a staggeringly large volume of magma was erupted and placed as lava. This is the Siberian traps eruption. So all of this stuff that you're seeing here in the photo on the lower right is just layers and layers and layers and layers of magma that was erupted at this time. As it came up, it was actually volatilizing limestone carbonate rocks and coals and dumping a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and delivering that to the atmosphere. So it radically changed atmospheric chemistry. It increases the concentration of greenhouse gases, and it dramatically changed ocean chemistry. And now is the time to reflect if you're aware of any other time that a large amount of carbon has been taken out of the Earth's crust and moved into the atmosphere and the oceans. Of course, that's what's happening right now with the burning of fossil fuels. The mechanism is different. The scale is a little bit different. The rate is a little bit different, but there's reason to think that we should be really aware of and interested in these times in Earth history where carbon has shifted dramatically from one pool to another, because it's clearly had a major consequence on life on Earth. And we're living through a very different, but not entirely unrelated event right now. Okay, so what's the consequence of this from the marine ecosystem perspective? I've got my cute little picture up here at the top right. This is a specific cultural reference for me. Grew up playing the original 8-bit Nintendo video game system, where whenever you got frustrated with the game and it wasn't going how you liked, you could just hit that reset button and start over again, right? And so that's essentially what happened during this mass extinction event from the Permian into the Triassic. Really what we saw was that these sort of climax ecosystems of the Permian that were very diverse, that have lots of different organisms, reef building things, fish, sharks, almost all of these went extinct with just a few survivors hanging on. When we look at ecosystems immediately after the event, they look very archaic. They look like what we had before the Cambrian explosion of diverse multicellular life. And we essentially kind of rebuilt marine ecosystems from scratch. But what happened was we didn't rebuild the same ecosystems that we had in the Paleozoic. We actually initiated a new trajectory of life. And so what happens in the Triassic is you start to see different organisms taking hold of marine ecosystems, and implied here by this lower F figure right here, the first appearance of large terrestrial adapted animals moving back into the oceans. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but this is one of the key distinctions that we have in the Mesozoic, and it persists to today, as we've got organisms that had lived and evolved on land now moving into marine ecosystems and taking a role as apex predators that had never happened in the Paleozoic. So this is a bit of a complex figure here, but I'll try and go through it pretty quickly, drilling down on the evidence for this transition. So what we see here, and I apologize, cut off a little bit, but major geochemical changes in the oceans. In this case, it's carbon isotopes. And carbon isotopes respond to things like how much productivity is happening in the water, as well as injections of carbon from methane and from carbon dioxide. It won't go too deep into the weeds here, but when it's going back and forth here a lot, that means that the environment's very unstable. Temperatures are changing, productivity is likely changing. And then when you see it shifting to this more stable zone here in the light green means that the ecosystem has kind of recovered and started to move towards a more stable conformation. When we compare the fossil record to the geochemical record, we see kind of the same thing. So I won't go through each of these, but I did, and I think Russell is somewhere in here in the talk. So I wanted to shout out one thing that's noteworthy about the early Triassic is that you've got the return of these weird things called stromatolites. These are microbial structures made by cyanobacteria that were really abundant in the Proterozoic, like the early interval of life on Earth before multicellular organisms were kind of dominating Earth ecosystems. And it helps to reinforce this idea of a reset. So these things show up as abundant in the early Triassic, and then they start to decline. Coincident with that, we see whatever organisms were able to survive and persist across the mass extinction event, most of them are really tiny and they're low in diversity. That's what these two pieces of the figure are showing right here. So you don't have very many things that are surviving, but some things do survive, and they're all really, really small. And then you eventually start to see the recovery of things like sponges and corals that will start to recreate and rebuild reef ecosystems, the type of diverse marine ecosystems that we think about today when we imagine like a healthy marine ecosystem. Laid in on here is the diversity of marine reptiles. And so I'll talk about this a little bit more as we go, but there's a sense that marine reptiles are part of this restructuring and recovery of marine ecosystems. They're not waiting until everything comes back into full stability. They actually seem to get a jump on it. We see marine reptiles appearing in the fossil record right as marine ecosystems are kind of starting to get themselves back together. And so there's an open question right now about, are marine reptiles responding to this just opportunistically? Or are they somehow actually facilitating the recovery? We know now that large marine animals are important for regulating and stabilizing marine ecosystems. The classic example are sea otters off the coast of California. When all the sea otters were removed via overhunting, you see a collapse in kelp forests because they were controlling sea urchins and other things. We can't draw a one-to-one analogy between sea otters and these Triassic marine reptiles, but there's a reason to think that having large predators in your ecosystem helps to stabilize and open up more opportunity for diverse niches to be occupied by different organisms. Okay, and as I alluded to earlier on, the end of the Triassic, so now we're fast forwarding 50 million years. It's late for me, I apologize. 50 million years, we see a major shift in biodiversity, a major mass extinction event. And this again is linked to a large scale shift in the Earth system. So over the course of the end of the Paleozoic, towards the end of the Permian, you had the assembly of Pangea. So I guess, depending on how familiar people are with these dynamics, sometimes it's thought that Pangea was just the stable state that existed in the past and then it broke up. It's not the case. The continents are constantly moving around through Earth history and have had multiple cycles of assembly and disassembly. So through much of the Paleozoic, you had the continents scattered slowly over, from 500 to 250 million years ago. They started to accrete themselves into this large supercontinent called Pangea. And then at the end of the Triassic, that supercontinent started to collapse and fall apart and split itself apart. The Atlantic Ocean starts to open at this point about 200 million years ago. And as it did so, you again had massive volcanic eruptions happening, large amounts of carbon spewed out to the atmosphere, big oscillations in global temperature, and you again see major shifts in ecosystems on land. That's what's better shown by this Douglas Henderson interpretation, reconstruction here, with the first dinosaurs appearing on land, for example, and the first pterosaurs. But in the ocean, we also see a major shift as well. So the Triassic is really important for understanding Earth history because it's bracketed between these two major shifts that are controlled by tectonics and volcanism and climate change, but also witness major scale changes in the composition of ecosystems on land and in the oceans at the same time. And again, that the fact that the fossil record records simultaneous changes is a good evidence that the Earth functions as an interconnected whole. It's not just one thing happening one place and one thing happening somewhere else. What happens in one place is linked to something that happens somewhere else. And much of our understanding of that comes from the fossil record and the geologic record. Okay, so why marine reptiles though? Why are they worth considering in this grand scale arc of life? Well, they're cool, but also they're important. So they're important in a few ways. They're important culturally and scientifically because marine reptiles actually were discovered and studied before dinosaurs ever were. Your preservation potential in a marine environment is much better than in a terrestrial environment. Your sort of chances of getting buried and preserved as a fossil are much better if you live a little bit below sea level than if you live above sea level. So some of the first large fossils to be discovered were marine reptiles, like Mosasaurus here that was discovered in a limestone quarry in the Netherlands in the 1770s, well before dinosaurs were ever named or studied or identified. And finding giant reptile fossils in the rocks at this time of enlightenment and cultural, social, and scientific change was hugely important, right? It raised huge questions about what had been happening in Earth history before humans were around, potentially, right? The idea of before humans were around was a new concept, and this was kind of introduced by the idea that, well, do we really have any recorded evidence of these things existing? And if not, maybe we don't have the full picture from the texts that are available to us. Fast forward to England just a little bit later, Mary Anning, who at this point has been the subject of many, many books. I have a bunch of kids' books around here that I could pull up, but they're not within arm's reach. The Kate Winslet film from this past year, Ammonite. I mean, Mary Anning now at this point is almost a household name or close to it, but at any rate, she is sort of singularly or at least dominantly responsible for discovering and bringing to attention the amazing marine reptiles that are preserved on the southwest coast of England, what's called the Jurassic coast. So Mary was actually part of a whole family of fossil hunters. Her dad was a fossil hunter before he passed away in young Mary's life. Her brother was also a fossil hunter. And so these were working class people. They were actually part of a religious minority in England. They didn't have access to sort of the corridors of authority and power, but they were finding stuff that was really, really significant and important. Mary in her life befriended a number of influential earth scientists and paleontologists in the sort of academic and intellectual spheres of England. And as this is maybe a hot take, almost as much or as much as somebody like Charles Darwin, you can single her out as causing a major shift in the sort of thinking of Earth history and sort of what can we learn from studying rocks by finding these organisms that had clearly no counterpoint in anything alive today. The fossils that she was finding were forcing scientists, natural historians to really try and think about, like, how do we explain and account for these totally unexpected organisms in the rocks, right? And again, this is ichthyosaurs. This is marine reptiles. So these are these, and she helped to identify and name these first ichthyosaurs, fish lizards. And this is before dinosaurs, right? So we think of dinosaurs as the central important figure of paleontology, but it's these marine reptiles that actually sparked the first public and intellectual boom in trying to understand what we can learn from the vertebrate fossil record. In addition to these first ichthyosaurs that she found, Mary Anning found the first plesiosaur fossils, these weird long-necked things. This is actually a quite remarkable drawing here, a sketch from Mary Anning's notebook, because it's made from fossil ink. She actually ground up fossil squid ink and reconstituted with water to sketch this fossil plesiosaur right here, this long-necked marine reptile. But again, it's not only the fact that these things were not expected in England, right? Like ichthyosaurs, well, they kind of looked like crocodiles, so, you know, that's weird. But here's a thing that just has zero counterpart in any living organism today. This long-necked reptile with paddle-like, whale-like limbs, a snake-like neck, and this weird head. And again, this is pre-Darwin, right? This is sort of posing the question, how do you account for and explain organisms that have no counterpoint in living things? They're totally different. That's a major challenge to the understanding of a sort of stable and designed biological system. Okay, so this is a little bit of a leap, but I want to kind of fast forward to contemporary understanding and contextualizing of marine reptiles. So we understand now, thanks to Charles Darwin and everybody else who came afterward, that we can link together all living organisms in a family tree. And we do this based on shared characters and shared characteristics. And we can identify relationships between organisms based on commonalities. So when we look at land vertebrates today, including mammals, birds, lizards, amphibians, we see commonalities in their skeleton and their body plan that lead us to understand that they all have a shared single ancestor. They have a common origin. And one thing that's fundamental is that all of those organisms come from a four-limbed body plan. So even though snakes and birds and other things modify this body plan substantially, we can trace the origin of land vertebrates back to fish like tiktaalik and other lobe-finned fish, like lungfish and coelacanths are also close relatives, and understand now that fish were able to engage in a variety of adaptive shifts that allowed them to colonize and live on land. And all terrestrial vertebrates today, anything that you can name in the amphibian, reptile, bird, or mammal group, they all have a common ancestor that left the water about 350 million years ago. We have this transition pretty well documented in the fossil record. And I see that I'm talking way too much. I need to get to my own Shasta stuff, so I'll try to talk more quickly, but we understand this transition well based on fossils. We would never be able to reconstruct it just based on, say, studies of genetics or developmental biology, right? We need the fossils to understand it. But what's really remarkable is that a number of different terrestrial lineages flip the equation around and go back into the ocean. So most of you are likely familiar with the concept that whales are mammals, right? But merely by saying that, it implies that they have gone through this entire process once and then back again the other way, that whales have terrestrial ancestors that lived on land that then changed their mind and went back into the ocean. And what's quite striking is that this has happened dozens of times in the history of life on Earth. So up here in red, many different mammal groups, seals, manatees, whales, and some extinct groups have gone from terrestrial life back into ocean life. A variety of bird groups, although a little bit in a less committed sense, have gone from land back into the water. And a bunch of reptiles did so, and they were the first to do so. So again, we can trace this back to the Triassic here, which is when, which is when the first reptile groups are moving back into the ocean, coincident with that major shift in ecosystems after the end Permian mass extinction event. That's this sort of 3, 4, 5, 6 dots right here. There's a few groups that start toying with this a little bit earlier on, but they don't get super successful and they don't persist for very long. So why is this of interest? Well, as evolutionary biologists, we're interested in these massive shifts in lifestyle, right? And so if you're going to live in the ocean and you have descended from organisms adapted to life on land, you've got to solve a bunch of different challenges. You've got to figure out how to get oxygen, how to move, how to balance your salt in your body, how to use your hearing and sight or other senses to perceive things accurately through a medium that has different density and viscosity, how to reproduce. But of course, you would never do it in the first place if there weren't some opportunities, right? So water has advantages. It's more buoyant. It can allow you to travel to new areas. There may be an absence of predators that have been harassing you on land. There may be an absence of competitors. There might be new food to find. And so the combination of new opportunities and new challenges drives major evolutionary changes. It drives adaptation, right? And so we see major shifts. Incidentally, this is a sloth swimming in water off Costa Rica. And we have evidence that sloths at least once and possibly twice have colonized marine environments and adapted to life in the water. So again, it's just a persistent feature. There's many, many different animals that somewhat surprisingly have adapted to life in the oceans, readapted, I should say, to life in the oceans. As far as reptiles today, we don't have a lot in the oceans. There's 7 sea turtles, or seven sea turtle species. They've been around for a long time, but they're not super diverse. There's 60 snakes in the ocean. They've apparently entered the ocean pretty rapidly, but they're constricted to the Indo-Pacific region. And there's some things like crocodiles and marine iguanas that spend some time on land and some time in the ocean. But going back to the Mesozoic, the interval when dinosaurs were dominant on land, we have many different reptile groups that were living in the ocean. There's a lot going on here in this figure, so I won't spend too much time on it. But the green polygons here are showing how many marine reptiles are persisting at different intervals of Earth history. And so you see, again, similar to what we looked at early on in the talk, rise and fall, right? Diversification and extinction events, these cycles of new groups appearing and disappearing. And we can link those to things like changes in sea level, changes in ocean chemistry. And again, the takeaway from this is just that nothing's happening in a vacuum. The entire Earth ecosystem, Earth system is evolving as one, with different organisms responding to broad scale changes in climate and tectonics and seawater chemistry, and all of this feeds back into itself. We already talked about this, so I can skip it. And we already talked about that too. So just a quick intro to the things that I'll be talking about here towards the end with different organisms in the Triassic. So we've got ichthyosaurs here. Ichthyopterygia is the broader group that includes ichthyosaurs and their close relatives. Sauropterygians, which are the groups that include plesiosaurs, but also their close relatives, and then a bunch of other things. And the names aren't critically important, but what we do see in the Triassic is lots of different groups diversifying, suggesting that there really was new opportunities in the ocean here, probably controlled by that mass extinction event, really opening up space for things on land to move in and occupy new environmental and ecological roles. Okay, why Western North America? Well, it's easier to get to, but also there's really fantastic stuff to see and lots of unanswered and even unasked questions. And just have been talking way too much. I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly, but we can trace back the history of study of marine reptiles all the way back to when the first railroads were being put through with the Transcontinental Railroad. People like Josiah Whitney and Joseph Leidy, who are important in the sort of history of paleontology and geology in North America. Some of this stuff got back to Joseph Leidy, and he described that there were giant ichthyosaurs, apparently, from Nevada. Not too much after that, you've got James Perrin Smith, who actually did his master's work here at Vanderbilt and taught high school science and math in Nashville, which is kind of one of the weird crossings of history here. But he ultimately wound up at Stanford and became part of the USGS survey, traveling around California and Nevada and other parts of the Western United States, documenting fossils and trying to map out the stratigraphy of this region. He stumbled across some fossil reptile bones, and he notified his colleague at Berkeley, John Merriam, who recognized the significance of this, but didn't have the money to go out and collect them. He actually asked his student in his classes, Annie Alexander, who was the sugar baroness of Northern California. So her family was originally from Hawaii and was part of the CNH sugar dynasty. And so she was there at Berkeley based on her own interests in natural history, one of the few women students at the time at Berkeley. And Miriam asked Alexander if she would be interested and willing in helping to fund this and other scientific expeditions. And she was, as long as she was able to participate and go out and help to find the fossils. And he was happy to bring her along. And so over the course of about 10 years, around the turn of the last century, in 1901 to 1910, they went out to the region of what's now Shasta Lake, north of Redding, along the Pitt River arm, and collected hundreds of fossil specimens. So you can get an idea of, it was very hard work. It was very rugged terrain as it is today, but there was no reservoir there. They were traveling up canyons on horseback, trying to find fossils and lugging them back out to get prepared back at Berkeley. There's one of those early ichthyosaur fossils that they found over on the right. This is probably Merriam here down on horseback, although it's a little bit hard to say. There's fantastic information about the history of paleontologic investigation and exploration in this region, hosted by the University of California Museum of Paleontology website. Got some links on later slides, and happy to share that stuff with anyone who's interested. So here's some of the stuff that they found. Marine reptiles, and quite a lot of them, bits and pieces, skulls, vertebra, girdles, including ichthyosaurs, but also this new group that had never been described before called thalattosaurs, that are similar to ichthyosaurs in some way, but also different. In fact, Merriam ultimately named a large number of different species. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ichthyosaurs and 3 thalattosaurs from this area. Over time, the distinction between all of these different species has been questioned, such that it's been narrowed a little bit down. We may have something like 4 valid ichthyosaur taxa and maybe 2 valid thalattosaur taxa, although this is a constant cycle, right? We find all these fossils, we get really excited, we give new names to them, we study them, we decide, oh, maybe these are just like larger and smaller individuals, or maybe we have one part of one and one part of another. So we lump them together, and then someone else comes along and says, actually, that one was pretty interesting and pretty different. And then they split it back out again. This is just a constant cycle in paleontology of sort of making a new name, sinking it back down. You are likely or potentially familiar with this sort of Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus phenomenon, and the idea of names coming in and out of fashion. This is how science should work, right? We should be proposing new hypotheses, testing and scrutinizing them, and then revising them, but not saying, okay, once we've revised it, it's fixed and we're never going to revisit it again. So it's not a sign that science is weak or uncertain. It's just how the scientific process works. Thalattosaurus perini here with a strikeout. We have just recently refound that specimen buried deep in the collections of the California Academy of Sciences at San Francisco, and it does look like it's its own new species or distinct species. So that one's probably coming back. Stay tuned. So Annie Alexander and John Merriam continued their work beyond California into Nevada with a whole bunch of other specimens that they found and described. Really importantly, I think these early expeditions through the University of California Museum of Paleontology had women as important components of the field team. So Annie Alexander, obviously, as the primary funding mechanism, was central, and a bunch of the fossils that were discovered were named after her, perhaps as a cultural signifier of the time. It was thought that Annie shouldn't be out there with a bunch of men by herself. And so there were a number of other women who were brought on as companions and field partners with Annie Alexander. Over here on the left is Edna Wemple, who is actually the first master's student in paleontology at Berkeley, who came out and collected fossils and published her work on fossil sharks with Annie Alexander. There are actually a couple of other women who came out and participated with Annie Alexander on these and other expeditions. So I don't have time to go into all the names and the stories, but I encourage you to, if you're interested, take a look at the history archives on the University of California Museum of Paleontology website. There's great discussion of these different figures and their impact on science at this time. Okay, I'm going to skip past a bunch of these other slides because I just got way too excited at the front end and talked way too much. But I guess the take-home message here is that science continued to evolve. We continued to find new specimens across the Western United States and up into Canada as well, including one of my favorite sites to work here in central Nevada, Berlin Ichthyosaur State Park. And again, this, even though the first couple of slides there showed mostly men, this has been men and women working on these projects, including people like Betsy Nichols, who's a really important figure, and Judy Massari as well, to just name a couple. And I apologize for skipping so far forward here. So we now are starting to reconstruct, again, the trajectory of life in the oceans in this region over 50 million years. And that's kind of what I've been working on and trying to clarify and understand, is we see very different types of marine reptiles in the early Triassic rocks from those we find in the late Triassic rocks. And so we want to understand what's happening to cause this shift in marine reptile fauna over this time. It's probably not just a simple factor of two mass extinction events at either time, but also major changes in what these animals are doing, how they're interacting with their environment, and what's available to them. So again, we've got good indication that this is not just a local phenomenon. So we have fossils from the early Triassic of Nevada that look very similar to things that we find in British Columbia and China, suggesting that there's a global scale story that's happening here. This is an ichthyosaur jaw, two ichthyosaur jaws. They're fragmentary. There's only a sort of set amount of information that we can draw from them, but they point toward big scale changes in marine ecosystems at this time. Okay, here's what you really want to hear about now that I'm almost at time, or I guess after time. What's been going on up in Northern California at Shasta. So we've gone back now over the past few years to these same regions that Annie Alexander and John Merriam were finding important fossils from 100 years ago. There's more fossils there to be found as you will know if you go and look at the exhibit. So we still have a lot of questions about how many species were actually present and what were they like. A lot of those fossils that were collected from the initial expeditions are fragmentary or incomplete. So we'd like to have a full skeleton so we can understand how big were these animals, what was their skull and teeth like, what were they eating. So we've been going out trying to find this stuff. It's arguably a little bit easier for us to work out there because we can take a boat up the reservoir that didn't exist when Miriam and Alexander were trying to go up there, and they were traveling on horseback and with mules. Of course, that's only true when you carry enough gas for your boat. At least once we've almost run, well, actually not almost, fully run out of gas on the lake. So there's hazards even in the slightly cushier conditions that we have now. One interesting and cool thing that's come out of the work lately is the discovery of some new jaw material. And again, I'm past time here, so I'll try to wrap it up. But there's been a suggestion that this large ichthyosaur from Northern California, Shastasaurus, was maybe toothless and possibly a suction feeder, like some beaked whales today. There's reason to believe, just based on the fossils that we had available previously, this was likely not correct. The shape of the skull and overall conformation of the jaws didn't support the hypothesis that these were suction feeders. But I think if we can confirm that the jaws that we found up there at Shasta belong to Shastasaurus, and we need to do a little bit more work to nail that down. But this is not a suction feeder. This is a very scary animal that I would not want to meet in a dark alley with giant sharp teeth, and was likely not relying on suction for its food. It was probably tearing apart vertebrate prey or other animals to eat. It might have used a little bit of suction, just as orca or other things do, to help get some prey into their food, but was not a specialized suction feeder. I think that that is where I will stop since we're at time. I'm happy to talk about questions and answer anybody's pressing concerns about California marine reptiles or other things.
Thank you, Neil. That was very interesting, and I'm excited to see more on the ichthyosaur or the Shastasaur find in the jaw. And as you know, people can see that jaw in your very last slide at Gateway. So we do have some questions in the chat, and I will start with kind of a big picture question. How are you differentiating between early and late Triassic? How do you kind of figure that out through the rock record?
Yeah, great question. So there is the geologic time scale has been developed over now hundreds of years, essentially. But the initial understanding of that time scale was based on fossils, and especially invertebrate fossils, which are much more common than vertebrates. So things like shellfish, essentially, which are around everywhere. You can find them in most marine rocks, and they evolve fairly regularly, or at least consistently over time, so that you don't expect to find the same species of clam or of ammonoid, which is a shelled squid relative, in the early Triassic that you do in the late Triassic. So really what you're doing is looking at the rock layers and trying to figure out what fossils are present that help to key you in to where you are in this sort of geologic time scale. The numbers that I was throwing out, like 200 million years or 250 million years, that's come about via other lines of evidence. So we can get direct age estimates from volcanic rocks, from ash layers. We can also use the changes in the magnetic polarity of the Earth, which switches back and forth over Earth history, and some other things. So we kind of try to weave these all together and reconstruct different slices of Earth history. So there's specific nomenclature for early Triassic and late Triassic and middle Triassic, and each of those is divided and subdivided. They're defined based on fossils, but they're calibrated based on environmental evidence like volcanic ash layers or magnetic reversals in Earth history. Hopefully that answers the question.
So a related question from Teresa is, can ancient volcanic ash be traced back to the breakup of Pangaea?
Yes. So the volcanism that happened with the breakup of Pangaea was the type of volcanism that produces a tremendous amount of lava and not a lot of ash. So it's similar to what you see happening in like Hawaii with Kilauea basalt, like tons of lava pouring down and flowing down. But because of the silica content, I realize I'm getting a little into the weeds here, but you don't have a lot of explosive eruption, you don't throw a lot into the atmosphere. But, and I had a little bit of this that I kind of skipped over, there is potential to reconstruct a little bit of what was happening via chemistry. So these eruptions, even though they may not produce a lot of ash, tend to discharge a lot of mercury into the environment. And mercury is very bioaccumulative. As you are familiar, if you avoid certain types of seafood, it travels into organisms quite readily. And so there's a chance to reconstruct this using mercury deposits. And there was a slide, I think, that I showed briefly that hinted at that, but we're hoping to do a little bit more of that work to look at mercury in rocks to better understand the link between volcanic eruptions and changes in extinction events and changes in life. Yeah.
Thanks. Here's kind of a group question regarding sort of studying the evolution of these animals, and you talking about them going land, water, land, back and forth. What are some of the characteristics that you're able to identify that tells you that that was actually happening? The specific one is, how do we know that whales are mammals and adapted to aquatic life and not fish who developed mammalian characteristics? So how can you see that evolution through the fossil record?
Yeah, there's a few ways to approach that. And the sort of easiest way to think about it perhaps is the idea of hypothesis testing in science, right? Where you can frame those as two independent hypotheses. Either whales are descended from land mammals, or they're fish that somehow converged on mammal characteristics. And so for trying to test that scientifically, what we do is collect evidence, and that evidence comes from the fossil record, and it comes from genetics and other sources as well. And we can start to see, okay, genetically, we should be able to tell if fish and whales are more closely related, or if whales and hippos are more closely related. It turns out whales and hippos are quite closely related on a genetic basis. Then we look at the fossil record. Well, we find transitional whales that have legs, that are clearly spending some time in the water and some time on land. And again, that reinforces this idea that, okay, clearly whales are land mammals that have moved back into the ocean. So we can kind of reconstruct that evolutionary process based on multiple lines of evidence. The first part of the question was sort of like, what, generally speaking, do we see in that transition? Sorry, I think I focused on the second question. Did I answer the first one?
Yeah, I think it was just kind of a general question about how you're looking at the fossil remains to follow the evolution.
Yeah, I mean, there are things that I could bore you all night long with all the things that we look at, but there's a lot of stuff that's really important. The shape of the limbs and the structure of the limbs, because a limb that works well on land is not the same as a limb that works well in the water. The density and shape and size of the bones themselves. Animals that are living in the water want to typically have lower density bones that aren't going to impede them moving through the water very much. Something that lives on land, especially if it's big like an elephant, needs really strong, thick bones that are going to support it on land. And that's just sort of the basics, but you can get really deep into the weeds. You can look at the inner ear structure of organisms, which responds to balance and proprioception and tells you a little bit about, is that organism mostly living in the air, or is it mostly living in the water? So there's multiple, again, it's multiple lines of evidence that you want to try to integrate into each other.
I'm just going to ask one last question and then we will wrap up. Can you just talk about your passion and how you got started and what kind of you hope to see for your future in your fossil work?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm originally from California. I'm from like the San Luis Obispo County area. And I interestingly kind of like grew up thinking that I lived in an area that didn't have any cool fossils because there weren't any dinosaurs around. And I thought dinosaurs were the only cool fossils. And then I found, again, I'm like reaching, but I actually have some of the first fossils that I found as a kid here in the house. But like I realized that there were a ton of really cool and interesting fossils around where I grew up. They just weren't dinosaurs, but they were clams. And I found a fossil crab, and there's whale and sea cow fossils from close to where I live as well. And so I think that helped me to understand that paleontology and Earth history is not the history of dinosaurs. I think that's really important to understand, because I think that it's easy to think that dinosaurs, are the end all be all of understanding the history of life. And dinosaurs are cool and I like them. And I work in the Mesozoic, so I, am familiar with them, but there's so much more in the history of life. So that was one key revelation. I went to college and I thought I wanted to study fossils, and I started taking a bunch of biology classes. I learned a lot more about ecology and evolution, and I figured, well, it's actually a lot more interesting to study animals that are alive and you can access and you can observe them and watch what they're really doing. And so I took a bunch of classes in that and did a undergraduate research project on the breeding behavior of the American goldfinch, and then also was studying rocks and was like, but actually we can do both. Like we can try to carry our understanding of living organisms back into the past. We can use our understanding of the rock record to inform our understanding of what's with us today. And so I'm always trying to move back and forth between those two and not treat them as separate things that are, divided, but like everything that we see live today has ancestors that extend back billions of years, and we can't fully understand them unless we understand that context. So, my aim and my narrow little study focus is to try to kind of like better understand the present through the past and better understand the past through the present, which is cliched, but is true.
And I'm going to add my thanks for all of us for your coming. I'm going to say coming into our homes tonight. As I was listening, I thought, this is kind of like an Oxford or Cambridge or Vanderbilt tutorial. It's just here we are listening to, you could go on for hours and you would fascinate us, but thank you so very much for the interesting talk. I was thinking that it gives us insight and understanding about what may lie under our own feet and in our museums. So we really appreciate this. And I'm going to say to our audience, all the talks in the series and for the past few years can be viewed on our website. So please be sure to share that information with others. And remember, an annual membership to the museum will let you come in multiple times throughout the year to catch up on new data and new fossils as they are being uncovered, and you'll be able to watch science in progress in our demo lab. And then we'll see you next spring for our April Spring MWOW series. So we'll sign off.
Thank you for the invitation. I really had fun.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.